This note is on alkenes. And alkenes are a group of hydrocarbons where the carbons are connected with double bonds. These types of hydrocarbons, they may have more than one double bond in them, in which they would be called dienes or trienes or however many there are. But for our purposes, we're going to use compounds that have only one double bond. All right. So ethene being the simplest of the hydrocarbons where you can have a double bond, and there have to be at least two carbons, obviously, in the main chain. And generally, the stick diagram then is written like this, with two parallel lines to indicate the double bond. There's a carbon at this end and the carbon at this end, and each carbon has, of course, the maximum number of hydrogens on it, which would be 2 each, right? Because carbon can make a total of 4 bonds. 2 for each carbon are taken up with the double bond, and then 1 to each of the hydrogens. Here's an example of butene. And I'll talk about the naming of these compounds. There's another aspect of this that we'll get to later on, which you'll see in terms of the, if you remember from the hybridization video that I showed in the first unit, the arrangement around double bonds means that there's an isomerism that can happen with the configuration of where these species come off of the carbon. All right, alkenes are unsaturated hydrocarbons because each carbon only has 2 possible things attached to it besides the other carbon. And because 2 of the electrons are taken up in the double bond, it's actually possible to break the bond and then create something else that's attached to the carbon. Because carbon isn't bonded to the maximum number of species that can be attached to it, we call it an unsaturated hydrocarbon, because in order to be saturated, we'd have to break the double bond and add something else to each of the carbons. For that reason, the alkenes tend to be more reactive than alkanes. They have boiling points that are a little bit lower than the alkane of the same size, i.e. the same number of carbons. And they have this, what we call the cis and trans structural isomerism. The isomerism that takes place here is one because that double bond fixes the carbons so that the 2 things that are attached to each end carbon are in fact locked in place physically. And so there's no rotation around that carbon-carbon double bond. So let's talk about the cis and trans isomerism. What do we mean by that? A lot of students have some issues with looking at the 3-dimensional structure from what the paper structure looks like, and then making that transition in order to figure out, okay, what's fixed, what's not, what can rotate, and that kind of stuff. And so we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some of the 3-dimensional structures here to try and help you learn how to look at these diagrams. In order to name the compounds properly, you need to look at the orientation of the atoms around the double bond. All right, so in this orientation, if we write it down and put it on a flat paper, the structure around the double bond, if we draw a plane or a line of symmetry through the double bond, then we look at the largest things that are attached to the carbon atoms, to each carbon atom. So that would be this CH3 over here, and this CH2 CH3 part over here. Remember that in the other direction is the hydrogen, okay, which is not drawn in. And so we look at the two largest parts that are attached to each carbon, and we say, okay, are they both on the same side of that line of symmetry, or is one above and one below? So in the case here, in this example, both are below on the same side, and so this would be a cis isomer. We follow the same pattern for the naming of the longest chain for alkanes. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it would be a pentene. Okay, the double bond is in the second position, so it's a pent-2-ene. Okay, and because this is a cis isomer, we would call it cis pent-2-ene. All right, this is the same structure, except that this, because if we draw our line of symmetry through the middle here again, one is above and one is below. That's the trans isomer. And so we have then this one being trans pent-2-ene. All right, so the orientation of the longest chains in each carbon of the double bond indicates where the compound is cis or trans isomer. If both attachments to one of the carbons are the same, then you don't have any cis or trans isomerism. So in this example, on this end carbon, on this end of the double bond, there's just two hydrogens attached here. Since both things are the same, I can flip this around either way, and it's just flipping the molecule. It's not changing the actual structure. All right. So when these two things on one end of the carbon are the same, then you don't have cis or trans isomerism. So this one here, just for naming's sake, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons again, but this time the double bond is in the 1 position, in the first position. And so we call this pent-1-ine. All right, so try some of the homework. These are the pages in your textbook. Try them and bring questions to class. We'll talk about them then.